Hi everyone, in this lecture I want to talk about nationalism. And nationalism is going to become the dominant political force in 20th century Latin America, whereas liberalism had been the main political force in 19th century Latin America. In its place rises nationalism in the early 20th century. And many people had become disillusioned with liberalism by the early 1900s because it simply did not deliver on its promises of democracy and equality. And in its place rises nationalism. And so what I want to do here is I want to define it, talk a little bit about it in the Latin American context, and talk about some different forms of nationalism. And nationalism often has a negative connotation to it, particularly when we talk about the rise of nationalism in Europe, in places like Nazi Germany. Right? Nationalism was about excluding people from the nation, and it often led to international wars between nations. But in Latin America, it's a bit different. Nationalism, when you talk about it, depends on the context and where you're talking about it. In Latin America, I would argue, nationalism was a rather positive and cohesive force. And I think that'll become clear as I define it here. And so let me just give you a straightforward definition of exactly what nationalism is. Nationalism is a belief, creed, or political ideology that involves an individual identifying with or becoming attached to one's nation. So it's a lot like patriotism, the first bullet point I have here. There's a lot of similarities. A patriot and a nationalist, they both are very proud of their country, and they support their country and its values and its culture. But nationalism actually, from my perspective, goes a step further than patriotism. A nationalism is not only proud of their country and its history and its culture, but goes a step further and says, my culture and history is superior to other countries' culture and history. And that's that extra step it goes than just patriotism. So it's more than just patriotism. And nationalism in Latin America, it celebrated what was unique about individual countries. And this is what I mean by nationalism was a rather positive and cohesive force in Latin America, because it fostered a collective self-respect among individual countries in Latin America. Because if you remember, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the elites, they looked down upon the masses that they governed. They looked down upon the poor working masses. And that's going to begin to change with the rise of nationalism. Because in places like Mexico and Peru, and Guatemala and Ecuador, which have an indigenous heritage, the indigenous people had often been looked down upon by the elites in the 1800s. But by the mid-20th century, political elites are now going to actually say, indigenous Mexicans, indigenous Peruvians, they are actually representative of the nation, and they represent the heart and soul of the country. To be a Mexican means to have a Mexican heritage in you. And, it depends from country to country. Brazil, for example, this is when Brazilians start to extol their African heritage. Before Brazilians and political elites had looked down upon the country's African history. But with the rise of nationalism, now people are saying, Brazil has a rich tradition of its African people and its heritage. Nationalism also becomes a very powerful and cohesive force because it unites people from different social classes. And nationalism is going to replace ethnic and local identities with loyalty to the nation. And it's going to unite, wealthy Latin Americans and also poor Latin Americans. They're all going to, many of the nationalists are going to become proud to be Mexican or Colombian or Costa Rican, whichever country it may be. So it provides a sense of cohesion and inclusion, which is very, that's one big difference between, I think, nationalism in Latin America is that it's very inclusive of, the different races and the different social classes as compared to, say, nationalism in Europe. And we'll see also that nationalism, united people who were, more liberal and more conservative. Those on both the left and the right could be nationalists during this period. And it was particularly after the Great Depression when nationalism starts to grow in Latin America. But it had really been there since the late 1800s and the early 1900s, bubbling below the surface. And we talked about the foreign economic dominance of Latin America during the age of exports. And that tended to create resentment, and that kind of led to the rise of nationalism in early 20th century Latin America. And by the mid 20th century, it is the political force throughout the region. And a few other characteristics of nationalism in Latin America. Nationalism did, though, tend to lean more towards the left in Latin America. And particularly important to nationalism in the region was that nationalists were very anti-imperialistic. They resented the foreign influence in the region, and they began to see foreign countries as being exploiters of Latin America's natural resources and its economy. And these next two slides that I'm going to show you here, I want to talk about two specific forms of nationalism: cultural and economic nationalism. There's other forms such as ethnic nationalism, but these two here were very powerful forces in 20th century Latin America. Cultural nationalism, it celebrated a nation's culture, and it focused on how national identity was shaped by different cultural traditions. And as I mentioned, it cuts across different racial lines. And in particular, this is when Latin America began to celebrate its mixed racial heritage. And you see this in the arts. Writers begin to write about celebrating the mixed races and indigenous groups and blacks, and they're portrayed as the body and soul of the nation and under cultural nationalism. And a good way to kind of think about it that's very illustrative of cultural nationalism in Latin America in art specifically is this painting that you see here. And it is called Two Fridas, and it was done by Frida Kahlo in 1939. And you may know a little bit about Frida Kahlo. She was a painter and an artist in mid-20th century Mexico, and she was also married to Diego Rivera, and they had a pretty wild and romantic relationship. And I'll explain this painting here and what's going on and how it relates to cultural nationalism. So she mostly did self-portraits, by the way. And this is a self-portrait of her, and it has two Fridas. And on the left is the European Frida, and on the right is the Mexican Frida. And this has to do with the way that Diego Rivera viewed her, because Diego Rivera was, and like Frida Kahlo, they were both nationalist, and a lot of their paintings and murals had depicted national sentiments. And Diego always loved the Mexican Frida, right? When he liked the Mexican Frida much more than the European Frida. So on the left is the European Frida in the white European dress, and you can see it's portraying her heart there, an open heart, and it looks like the heart has been cut, or it might be suggesting perhaps that it's broken, or it's not completely whole. And so she's embarrassed about the European Frida because that's not the Frida that Diego loves. Whereas on the other hand, you have on the right you have Frida in the Mexican dress and the traditional Mexican costume of indigenous women, and that's the one with the whole heart that has not been damaged or is not bleeding. And so it suggests that what is Mexican, the Mexican costume, is better than the foreign European costume. And this was a completely different way of thinking about Latin American culture, because remember, before in the 19th century, elites had tried to imitate European culture and culture in the United States, right? They thought that was the center of civilization, and that's what should be replicated in Latin America. Another powerful form of nationalism in Latin America was economic nationalism. And I'm going to say more about this in the other video lecture this week, so I'll just briefly talk about it here. But going back to the colonial period and throughout the 19th century, it had been foreign powers that really exploited and benefited and enjoyed the wealth of Latin America's resources, going back to the silver in the colonial period, guano and coffee and bananas in the 19th century. And that tended, of course, to, over time, create resentment because it was foreign powers who were exploiting the wealth, and the wealth was being extracted out of Latin America and sent abroad instead of staying within the country to help develop its national economy. And Again, I'm going to say more about this, but Latin American countries, they're going to turn inward in the mid 20th century, and they're going to try to become more self sustaining, and they're going to raise barriers to foreign trade. And also, another aspect of economic nationalism is when the government actually takes over an entire industry. That's when the government nationalizes an industry. It takes it over and it expropriates it from private companies. And Latin American governments, they're going to take over industries such as the oil industry, which I'll say a little bit about here. They're going to nationalize the mining industry, electricity, telecommunications, airline industries. And we're going to see they're even going to promote land reform in many countries in the mid-20th century. And they're going to take away land from foreign landlords, for example. And these are when phrases such as "hecho en Mexico," made in Mexico, or "industria brasileira," Brazilian industry, or "producto argentino," Argentine product. These are when these phrases start to become popular. We can kind of think of they're similar to like "made in the USA" in the United States. And a really good, crystal clear example of economic nationalism was the oil nationalization in Mexico in 1938. And if you remember, Venezuela and Mexico, they were the first to export oil in the early 20th century. And it was foreign companies that had come in with the technology and began to exploit the oil. And over time, this started to create resentment among Venezuelans and Mexicans because the oil was being shipped abroad, and it was the oil companies that were benefiting from the wealth. Yes, they were taxed, but just a little bit. And the government just received some revenues from the oil production. But it became pretty clear after many decades of oil production how much wealth oil produced. And in Mexico, this became an issue during the 1910 Mexican Revolution, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. And throughout the 1920s and the early 1930s, there was a lot of resentment against the foreign-owned oil companies. And there was a lot of tense relations with the United States as well. Mexico's constitution that was written and published in 1917 said that all the subsoils, so the minerals and oil, all the wealth below the soil belonged to the Mexican nation. And this was just an ideal on paper in 1917, but throughout the 20s and the 30s, the Mexican government struggled to assert more control over the oil industry. And this created a lot of tension with the United States. The United States even threatened to invade Mexico if it took over the oil industry, and particularly in the 1920s. And in the mid-1930s, there was the Oil Workers Union in Mexico that went out and strike in 1936. And they were striking for better wages and more benefits against the oil companies. And the oil companies refused to negotiate with the oil workers in Mexico. And the strike just dragged on throughout 1937, and it really started to hurt the Mexican economy. And it created, a lot of nationalist sentiment throughout Mexico. And the president at the time, Lázaro Cárdenas, who I'll say a little bit about in the other lecture, he created a independent arbitration board so that the workers and the foreign oil companies would sit down at the table and they negotiate a compromise. But the foreign companies would not even sit down to negotiate with the Mexican oil workers. And so this is what pushed Lázaro Cárdenas on March 18th of 1938. He went on the radio and he announced to the nation that the government was taking over the oil industry. It was expropriating the foreign-owned companies, and the government would now run it. And they created a government monopoly on on the oil production. And it was called Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex. A very important company, still around today in Mexico. And when this happened in 1938, it was a very unifying event in Mexico. That's what you see here in the image, is that tens of thousands of people flocked to the streets to support the government. And really, at no moment before or since have so many Mexicans been united behind their government with the oil nationalization, because it was people on the left and the right of the political spectrum supported the nationalization. And this is going to occur in other countries. So Brazil, for example, is going to create its own oil monopoly called Petrobras is the company, which is still one of the largest companies in the world. And again, there's going to be other industries that are going to be nationalized throughout Latin America in the mid-20th century, and I'll talk more about those in the coming video lecture. Let me now talk about the Mexican Revolution of 1910 for a few minutes. Before I go into the details of it, though, it was a very much so a nationalistic revolution. And one key difference between nationalism in Mexico and elsewhere in Latin America is that nationalism in Latin America in the 20th century, it was primarily an urban-based phenomenon. It was in the cities where a lot of these nationalistic reforms took place. But Mexico was different because nationalism also became a strong force in the countryside in the early 20th century. And I think that becomes clear when I talk about the Mexican Revolution here. And the revolution was fought. It was 10 years of warfare from 1910 to 1920. And if you remember from our lecture a few weeks ago during the Age of Exports, a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, had ruled Mexico from 1876 until 1911. And the revolution started out as a cry for democracy to overthrow Porfirio Diaz. And some of the fighting began in 1910. And Porfirio Diaz, the 35-year dictator, he was overthrown in 1911. And it was clear, though, that just overthrowing the dictator was not going to solve many of Mexico's deep social problems. And so the fighting is going to continue to go on for the remainder of the decade. And it's a very chaotic event with lots of different actors coming and going. I encourage you to take my History of Mexico course if you'd like to learn more about it. We go into detail about it and spend several weeks on the revolution and the aftermath of it. And just to give you an idea of how deep the social upheaval was, because it really engulfed every corner of the country. Anybody who lived through it, it was probably the defining moment of their life that they never forgot, because the fighting was so intense. Upwards of about 1 million Mexicans perished in the 1910s. And this photo here that you see on the screen is the most famous photo of the Mexican Revolution, and it was taken in December 1914. And seated in the presidential seat is Pancho Villa, the famous caudillo of early 20th century Mexico. And to his left, there seated next to him, is Emiliano Zapata, who was the great agrarian leader of the Mexican Revolution. And if there was one issue that caused the Mexican Revolution, or that caused it to last so long, it was the land question that had to do with the great land inequality in Mexico that had been inherited from the colonial period and that actually became even worse during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so Zapata's slogan was land and liberty. They were fighting for land, to redistribute the land to the landless peasants throughout the country. And there were many different factions, and eventually the revolutionaries in the mid-20th century are going to start fighting among each other. So Villa and Zapata here, they very much represented the lower classes, the country people. And Villa is symbolically sitting in the presidential seat here, showing that it was the working people who were ruling Mexico in 1914, 1915. And there were other generals from the northern Mexico who would eventually fight a civil war with Villa and Zapata. And Villa and Zapata would lose that war, and the others would come to power. And I referenced the 1917 Constitution, which was written and published in 1917. And it was very much a nationalistic document. And it also promised land reform. And the fighting continues for the remainder of the decade, and eventually there's a general from Sonora, Alvaro Obregón, who takes power in 1920, and the 20s and 30s are actually when the great reforms of the Mexican Revolution come. And the government sought to implement a lot of some of the reforms, and some of the famous reforms that were carried out in the 20s and 30s, and it was really in the 1930s till the great reforms came out. Things like labor reform. This is when the government began to organize or to ally itself with labor unions, and they began to do things like raise wages for workers and provide more benefits to workers. And the workers become a very important supporting block of the government. And also, land reform was carried out extensively, and I'll talk more about this in our lecture about populism. And also, rural education was extended throughout the countryside. So they built, over 10,000 schools in the 1920s and 30s, and there was literacy campaigns to extend, the ability to read and write to Mexicans throughout the countryside. And of course, in the context of this was a kind of a great effervescence of art and culture that was bubbling up. So this was the context in which Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo were painting in the 1920s and the 1930s. And again, if you want to learn more about it, I encourage you to take my History of Mexico course. I teach it every semester. And I'll say a few more things, particularly about the land reform that occurred in Mexico in the 1920s and 30s in our other video lecture this week.